people. One of the greatest revolutions of thought revolved around two radically different answers to the question, what explains the great variety of life? From a Christian perspective, God created all the animals on earth a few thousand years ago exactly as they exist today. From a modern scientific perspective, the answer lies in the theory of evolution. Now, Charles Darwin, who is the man credited most for this theory, felt internally divided because he had long been a man of faith. He was raised Anglican and Unitarian. He prayed as a child and believed that God created the universe. He studied at Cambridge to become a minister. He married a devout wife, Emma Wedgwood, and loved her dearly. And that love clashed with his growing agnosticism. It was a painful conflict for Charles. Emma anguished about how her husband's naturalism increased his skepticism. It wasn't that Emma was opposed to his work. She loved nature. In fact, she saw that love of nature as part of her love of God. Understanding and caring about the natural world could demonstrate one's religious and ethical commitments. And in some ways, she was better prepared than Charles to see evolution not as a refutation of God, but as an example of God's handiwork. She was worried, though, that Charles' lack of faith would mean that he would not be by her side in heaven. Now, the couple did what many stiff upper-lipped Brits did when confronted with controversy. Charles Dunford, who wrote the book Charles and Emma Darwin, The Option to Believe, wrote that they managed their, quote, dissonance of belief in their married life with the classic English habit of not talking about it. So when Emma did bring it up, she brought it up gently. She suggested that Charles could believe in God and evolution because they are different types of belief. She wrote, "May not the habit in scientific pursuits of believing nothing till it's proved influence your mind too much in other things which cannot be proved in the same way, and which, if true, are likely to be above our comprehension? In other words, must everything, beauty, love, God, be measured by science? Can faith in science and religion coexist?" Now, outside the Darwin home, as scientific evidence for evolution grew, many Christians were uninterested in such coexistence because they viewed science as a threat to divine wonder. They preferred the easy awe of ignorance disguised as devotion to mystery. Some preferred to stare open-mouthed at rainbows and eclipses and simply thank God for their experience and move on. Scientific explanations, they claimed, replaced mystery with a dull, dry, material explanation. And some believers felt that science isolated them into a skeptical, rational subjectivity full of existential dread. Without God, they felt abandoned. So as Darwin's work came to light, the church pushed back. Adam Sedgwick, who was both a scientist and a clergyman, said he read Origins of the Species, quote, with more pain than pleasure. He claimed that humans, deprived of faith in divine creation, quote, would suffer a damage that might brutalize it and sink the human race. Claims about our evolutionary roots led to mocking public insults. Cartoons showed Darwin, his head on a body of a gorilla. He was accused of destroying the framework of ethics, giving us license to, quote, behave like wild animals. Now, that was an insult, but it's because they didn't really understand wild animals. That's another talk. Now, such attacks on evolution continued after Darwin's death in 1924. The American Anti-Evolutionary Association was founded, and it was open to members to all except, and I quote, Negroes, atheists, infidels, agnostics, evolutionists, and habitual drunkards. Now, I don't know which part of that membership criteria is more insulting, but the whole thing is unbelievable. But it puts science on notice that even in the 20th century, evolution was not going to have an easy go. The next year, the Scopes monkey trial put America's religiously grounded ignorance on display. In 1954, the author C.S. Lewis parodied evolution's lack of plan or direction or purpose. How could it possibly bring out the best, he said, and it was in his poem called Evolutionary Hymn. It mocks struggle for struggle's sake and claims that only God assures the world both the physical order of the world and the moral order of the world. It goes like this. Lead us, evolution, lead us up the future's endless stair. Chop us, change us, prod us, weed us, for stagnation is despair. Groping, guessing, yet progressing, lead us nobody knows where. Wrong or justice, joy or sorrow, in the present, what are they? While there's always jam tomorrow, while we tread the onward way, never knowing where we're going, we can never go astray. To whatever variation our posterity may turn, hairy, squashy, or crustacean, bulbous eyes or square of stern, tusked or toothless, mild or ruthless, towards the unknown God we yearn. Ask not if it's God or devil, brethren, lest your words imply static norms of good and evil, as in Plato, throned on high. Such scholastic, inelastic, abstract yardsticks we deny. Far too long have sages vainly glossed great nature's simple text. He who runs can read it plainly. Goodness equals what comes next. By evolving, life is solving all the questions we perplexed. Oh, then, value means survival. Value, if our progeny spreads and spawns and licks each rival, that will prove its deity. Far from pleasant by our present standards, though it may well be. So, at the heart of that is a fear of moral relativism. That disturbs Christians like Lewis. In the phrase, never knowing where we're going, we can never go astray, is an accusation that evolutionists are equating goodness with whatever comes next. Ethics is reduced to the product of evolution. Now, ironically, that type of reductionism is very similar to the type of reduction that many Christians do when they say, God's will. It's basically saying, don't need any direction. We just let it be. Now, today, that critical thought that science requires seems to be disappearing. Only about a third of U.S. adults agree that evolution is a scientific theory well supported by evidence. At least that many believe that God created humans as they are 10,000 years ago. Once we were a nation renowned for science, and now we have this stunningly anti-intellectual portion. Now, in the hopes that it will help us defend evolution, let me first offer a simplified explanation. Evolution is what happens when you combine random genetic mutations with environmental pressures over a very long stretch of time. Mutations, environment, and time. When the mutations express themselves in ways that affect reproduction, it can lead species to die off or flourish in forms most beautiful and most wonderful, as Darwin wrote. Now, when I was a kid, I remember being taught evolution by my parents when they talked about giraffes, right? That giraffes at one point had medium length necks, and then as the environment changed and more food was available only well above the ground, the longer necked giraffes could eat, and then they could have more kids, and that's why we have long necked giraffes. Made sense to me. Now, natural selection, which is actually the term Darwin preferred to evolution, can be sped up or slowed down in a couple of ways. If there's a natural disaster, for example, a volcano, that can speed up which traits help you survive or not. This is called the bottleneck effect. Also, there's a subgroup of species, if it migrates to a different area, and it's away from one group, that group, because the environment's different, can either die off or grow more quickly. And that's called the founder effect, the founder of different colonies. Now, Darwin was just one of many people developing the theory of evolution, and most of the evidence he had was widely available. His genius lay in his ability to see old evidence in a new way. He just put three old assumptions together: that offspring inherit characteristics from their parents, that new inherited changes pop up at random, and that nature determines which characteristic survives. That's evolution in a nutshell. Now, like C.S. Lewis, many critics of evolution are dispirited by the impersonal, mechanical nature of evolution. A simple random accident is the term used, and it's used as an insult. But this is more a reflection of their perspective than the theory and the evidence. I find the simplicity of the explanation of evolution over this mind-boggling span of time amazing. Geological discoveries helped Darwin appreciate how the world was much older than we ever believed. I mean, just this timeline alone is amazing. 30 million years ago, the first anthropoid apes roamed the earth. 30 million years. 5 million years ago, the human lineage began to emerge as distinct. And about 2 million years ago, the human brain began to develop very quickly. Now, for many naturalists, these explanations are impressive and immediate before their eyes. All around us, the rapture is in nature. But it's always been challenging to convince long-term believers in faith of this new form of wonder. Thoreau wrote, "You can hardly convince a man of an error in his lifetime, but you must content yourself with the reflection that the progress of science is slow. If he is not convinced, his grandchildren may be." That's why we have to teach evolution in school and resist creative uses of the Bible to explain nature. It's not just a random process. There is a complex interplay of genetic mutations and the environment. Richard Dawkins writes how, quote, "Natural selection is about as non-random a force as you can imagine." The brilliant science writer Natalie Angier adds, "To characterize life as embodying accidents is highly misleading, no matter what your spiritual leanings may be. Life is the anti-accident, the most thermodynamically profligate heave-ho ever instigated, and subsequently amplified, annotated, explicated, expurgated, renovated. Well, you get the idea," end quote. I get the basic idea, but it's full of complexities that are used by others to attack evolution. Critics often trot out what they call gaps and inconsistencies of evolution, gaps that are admitted by proponents of evolution, but the critics often fall prey to a poor understanding of science. Good science never claimed airtight, dogmatic, complete, and final explanations of reality. Only some religions promise that. The holes in scientific theory are not problems for science, but rather the reason science exists. Scientists are motivated by discovering weaknesses of their theories. We're working on it is a legitimate response, not an admission of error. It's the nature of understanding to evolve. For example, I remember as a kid being talked about how they were looking for the missing link. But that metaphor is no longer used by scientists because it offers this misleading idea that somehow there's this straight path from apes to humans. So they use other metaphors more now, like the tree of life with many branches, or even the interconnected web of life, which is even more complex. And besides, on a very simple level, even the idea of a missing link is actually very poor as a way to try to explain things. Because if you have apes and humans, you have a gap, and you're looking for the link, right? Well, let's say you find a creature that somehow shows a progression. Well, now you have two gaps, and you got to explain those. So gaps aren't the problem. Some people find that frustrating, but that actually fuels science. Good research should produce more questions than it started. That's the point of research. In fact, some scientists are disappointed if their thesis is proved true. If it's not proved true, they then apply for another grant. Figure it out. So questions are not a sign that one's understanding is weak, but it's a sign that you know enough to ask more questions. Besides, the weakness of various scientific theories are being answered more and more by things like evolutionary developmental biology, which is very, very exciting. Now, there are less intellectually convincing attacks on evolution that focus on it being, quote, just a theory. That was actually used in a case in Pennsylvania 15 years ago. They basically trying to equate theory with arbitrary guesswork. Isaac Asimov put it this way. He said, creationists make it sound like a theory is something you dreamt up after being drunk all night. Well, that's what I think when I read some religious myths. That's my perspective. But that's the problem. Those are untested and untestable hangovers from the past, from my perspective. Evolution is not just a theory. It's also a vast collection of test results gathered over decades, analyzed publicly by thousands of researchers. It's the best our collective community of inquiry can offer. Now, it's true that evolution doesn't give us a simple map. David Sloan Wilson, who wrote the book Darwin's Cathedral, a wonderful book, points out that Darwin left us not a map, but a challenge. Evolutionary theory explains how things have worked in the past, not necessarily how we should try to live in the future. He writes, evolutionary theory is not the kind of a belief system that hurls you like an arrow in a previously chosen direction. It's more like a sailboat or a kayak bobbing on by the shore, inviting you to take a voyage of discovery. Well, young Charles Darwin took a voyage of discovery, and it's awfully romanticized quite often. Remember, it took nearly 5 years of painstaking collection, rough seas, bouts of seasickness, and stretches of monotony. Science, both its hypotheses and its processes, are arduous and humbling. They are human creations, so they must contain human limitations. Science, like human beings, is not perfect, so we have to appreciate where we are and where we want to go, how we can be better. Now, few people were as aware of the distance between human actuality and human potential than Felix Adler, who founded ethical culture. That distance plagued him. Unfortunately, as I said before, Adler was a bit limited by the antiquated thinking of his age. Like many of traditional faiths, he was worried that evolution painted humans as mechanistic creatures struggling to survive. Because he respected Darwin's intellectual integrity and his theory, and he was worried that it would be insufficient to maintain the dignity of our species, he walked on an intellectual tightrope, as leader Joe Schumann put it. To explain human dignity without relying on God, Adler took an introspective turn into idealistic philosophies of Plato and Kant. And in that philosophy was a hierarchical view of life. He described human psychology in the 1920s, writing on about a traditional Victorian devaluation of animals. I mean, look how he talks about human beings. He says, one must distinguish between two selves in everyone, between the animal self and the divine unclouded self. Those instincts, those sensual infirmities, those cruelties, those crushing instincts are part of our animal heritage. As if there was nothing good about being an animal, whether it's human animal or other animal. For Adler, only humans were worthy of profound respect and ethical concern. Now, that was a product of his age. I think that Adler may have seen things very differently had he been with Jane Goodall in the Gombe Reserve observing the gorillas. Would he see through the work of Darwin more reason to appreciate the moral weight of all sentient beings? T.S. Huxley, Darwin's best advocate, pointed this out back in 1963 that there is no, quote, cerebral barrier between man and the apes. But Adler focused on uplifting humans and likely did not appreciate how much other animals could teach us. With those with modern sensibilities and experience in the animal world, like Goodall, the dignity of all life is immediately accessible. Against the assumptions of an entire establishment that defined human beings as tool-making animals, Goodall showed that gorillas made tools. And her mentor, the archaeologist Louis Leakey, declared, "We must now redefine humans, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as humans." Now, that was well before the Genome Project proved that we have 98.5% of the DNA of gorillas. As the philosopher Mary Midgley put it, we are not just rather like animals, we are animals. Animals are not machines, and whatever marvelous capabilities humans have that animals lack, these capabilities are continuous with our animal nature. They're part of it. So today we know that animals have more vibrant experiences than we ever realized. Fish can be self-aware. Mammals experience post-traumatic stress. Elephants go to the places their parents died and their bones are baked into the clay to mourn. Those who point out that these observations are sometimes overdone say that, oh, you're engaging in anthropomorphism. You're attributing human characteristics to animals. When Goodall named the apes that she was observing with human names, there was David Greybeard and Mike and Flo, and her children Fegan, Fabian, Freud, Fifi, and Flint. I watch these films, I feel like I know them. They shared hugs and kisses, they were sulking, they got angry. Like humans, these apes displayed rationality and personality and joy and sorrow. So while we have to be aware of anthropomorphism, let's admit that we often are guilty of the very opposite. We often see other animals as fundamentally different from human beings. We have what the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould describes as a misguided habit to define a golden barrier, a firm criterion to mark the unbridgeable gap between the mentality and behavior of humans and all other creatures. Now, other than reframing both our scientific worldview and our perspective on non-human animals, evolution opens up for us other possible revolutions of thought. Just the fact that Darwin helped us see ourselves as being closer to animals should, to my mind at least, help promote a revolution of empathy. On the rare times that I walk through a primate exhibit at a zoo, I spend time looking into the eyes of these incredible creatures, and I think, what are they experiencing? What are our genetic cousins imagining? Appreciating our shared evolutionary story enriches my appreciation of their experience. The enlightenment about animals, whether it's human or non-human, has accelerated human rights activism. We take it more for granted when Peter Singer wrote in his book, Animal Liberation, quote, "If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration." More people sound like the late great vegetarian George Bernard Shaw, who quipped, "Animals are my friends, and I don't eat my friends." Now, that empathetic awareness may disturb people who are so used to placing human life on a pedestal, but for others it offers a refreshing breath of humility. I mean, Sagan found staring up at the cosmos deeply humbling, a reminder of our limited and fragile existence. When the images of Earth were sent back to the Earth for the first time, Archibald MacLeish wrote that it would revolutionize how we understand ourselves and the planet. The awe and interconnectedness and humility it would bring would help connect us to all of life. Thoreau put it this way, he said, "If you would learn the secrets of nature, you must practice more humanity." Now, admittedly, the story of evolution has been manipulated to support social Darwinism. Justifications for a ruthless competition are built on the misleading claims about survival of the fittest. The evolutionary biologist Jonathan Silverton explains this in his new book, Selfish Genes to Social Beings, A Cooperative History of Life, that evolution is not just about ruthless struggle. A lot of Darwin's work centered on the genetic efficacy of cooperation. Cooperation is a big part of the most basic building block of life in our biosphere. Take the bacteria called rhizobia, which lives at the root nodules of legumes. It helps keep those plants alive. Lichens, which are made up of algae and fungi, operate with remarkable homeostasis, even in the harshest environment. Cooperation and competition exist together. Now, what these insights about life offer is a new way to experience unity. For many people of faith, an all-embracing God offers them a form of an oceanic feeling of interconnection with all. That's a wonderful thing. But for many others, religion stresses division. Heaven and hell, holy and profane, saint and infidel, the saved and the damned. Darwin yearned to unify both human understanding and human beings. Mark Cohen, a British scientist, explains, evolutionary thinking enabled Darwin to rescue the idea of human unity, taking it over from a religion that no longer provided it with adequate support, and put the idea of common descent on a rational foundation. For Darwin, his work was a unity project. Evolution connected our insignificant subjective lives into a grand narrative. Einstein saw the unifying effect of science as religious in nature. I wish Darwin had been able to revel in that experience more, but he was so aware of the negative reaction his theory was going to get him. It caused him great anxiety. The resistance was even great in himself, confessing at one point that abandoning the assumption of a fixed and immutable species was like, quote, confessing a murder. He was particularly concerned about how his revolutionary thinking affected his dear wife, Emma. It had already killed his faith in God, and it led her to dread being eternally separated from her husband after death. Emma trusted her husband's intellectual ability and loved him deeply. In his book, Charles and Emma Darwin, The Option to Believe, Dunford appreciates how the personal tension of this marriage mirrored the tension in society. Darwin felt both tensions deeply. He couldn't accept the God of his culture, but he couldn't reject him. Darwin's predicament played out in the surprisingly long-lasting tension between theology and modern science that exists today. Now, in the end, Darwin never worked through the revolutionary tension as it arose in society, or in his marriage, or really in himself. In 1839, Emma wrote him a letter that suggested that Charles occasionally put his habit of, quote, believing nothing till it's proved empirically aside. There's no evidence that he engaged her about that letter. If he had, he may have learned to let science and religion coexist in the world and in his psyche. Emma did better. Dunford writes that Emma, quote, loved the whole Charles Darwin, of which his religious views were but a small part in her estimation. She did not insist that he change. She only wished he would. Now that pragmatic affection is a soothing contrast to a world of righteous overconfidence and glorification of conflict. I think maybe we need a revolution of heart that Emma demonstrated in her patient and kind affection of Charles Darwin. Thank you very much.